The first question is basically a biographical question of how you got involved in visual semiotics and what led you to this venture.
Right. Uh, well, my interest in visual semiotics came fundamentally from an interest in language, philosophy of language, any form of language. I'm a poet. I've published poetry. But certainly, verbal language and visual language are the main channels of communication. So there's music, but it's more difficult to understand. So from the very beginning, when I was young, then I was interested in philosophy of language. And from this, I was interested in art, poetry, art, new forms also that appeared in the 20th century, and how to understand and cope with all those so strange presentations. So from the very beginning, then I started to be an art critic. I wrote on theory of art and things of the sort. But otherwise, I had to earn a living. So I was a journalist by career. I was in a mass media journal in Quebec, La Presse, and then I was the editor of the French edition of Chatelaine, which was then the first feminist magazine in Quebec. And after 12 years there, when I was there, I wrote my doctoral thesis, and I was writing on art and publishing on art. So suddenly I was invited to become director of the Musée d'Art Contemporain in Montreal, which is then naturally involved in the very current artistic pursuit. So I was there for 5 years, 72 to 77. And then I felt that, well, it was very interesting. I liked it very much. But I felt that still contemporary art, very actual art, presented a lot of problems to the public. The public didn't understand what it was all about. Why do you exhibit those things, that my children could do? It happened with the Newman problem of National Gallery. Anyone can do that. Why do you pay such prices? Well, the simple question also people ask, why do you present these things, you exhibit these things? Why shouldn't we come here and even look at that? What's it all about? So I thought that not enough research was done in this field. So I turned to a university career to be able to make research. It was not possible in a very pragmatic context of museum. So then at the time, so 79, I was not quite aware of semiotics, though I was doing linguistics, structural descriptions of visual works, but I didn't call that semiotics at the time. But I realized, certainly when I went to really getting involved in research, that there was theories of language, of verbal and visual language, and that was they're called semiotics, systems of science, studies about how science organizes itself and means something. So this is how I became then interested in them, and I was really well, there's a lot done on verbal linguistics, but in visual representation, there was much less done. So as I was always been very interested in visual representations, and I devoted my time to that. And I finally made the proposition that if visual representation is a language, it means a painting or a sculpture are a linguistic representation and not simply an object. Well, as everyone was stating very justly, it must have a syntax, a code, a structure, because a language, has a level of expression and a level of content, and the level of expression is not the content. So you need then laws and codes, and how do you make a relation between what is said, what is viewed, and what could be the meaning, which is hidden. You never see a meaning. You only deduce it from the language. So then, a strange thing is that in visual language, there has never been any proposition of a grammar or syntax. Well, Kandinsky tried to do that, the artist Kandinsky in the 20s. And he started to put some elements there to construct a grammar of visual language. That didn't go very far because, he abandoned teaching. That's why he did that when he was teaching at the Bauhaus. But he abandoned this there. And since then, it never appeared in nowhere a proposition as to defining a grammar. Grammars, are not static, or they're not Bible things. Verbal grammar now, there's a tremendous explosion of knowledge. There's about maybe 20 types of grammars which have been evolved in the last, from the 50s to today. All kinds of verbal grammars, Chomsky, generative, transformational, systemic, structural, all kinds of grammars are made of verbal language. And each of them show different aspects and different ways of putting together the elements in a sentence, in a paragraph or a text, so as to show different kind of structures of meaning. Well, in visual language, there was none at all. So, in fact, then we had to produce, there was a group of research which was involved in Montreal, at the University of Quebec in Montreal, visual research. So we thought that if we want to have a theory of meaning, what is the meaning of visual artworks of sort, we need a syntax, we need a grammar. So we proposed the first visual syntax, and this is what is published in this book, which will be published in English next September in 1996 at the Indian University Press. So this book is only about a grammar of visual language. And it's very strange that it has come so late in our civilization, because the visual representation, as you know, was as old as man itself, in prehistoric times, from everywhere. In all societies, we have visual representation. It's very strange that never there was anyone going through the process of trying to explain what it is. There are many reasons for that. The first reason, I might say, is that most our own Western civilization is very much centered on the word, the logos, what we call phonocentry, logocentry. We seem to think, and still many believe, that verbal language is the only real language, bona fide language, and all the others are just secondary, restricted, not that important language. As long as we have verbal language, we seem to have the perfect instrument. Well, it doesn't seem that it works that way. There are verbal languages and there are non-verbal languages. Visual language is a non-verbal language. And the specificity of non-verbal language and the way they are constructed, because they are so different in their structure, their meanings are not the same than those which are carried by verbal language. It's completely different kinds of meanings. The way the language is organized and the meaning conveyed is completely different. So it means that to deal with visual language, to make a kind of a conversion in your mind, that you have to look to the world, to yourself, and to experience in a different way from the one which is carried by verbal language, which is the language to which all our representations of the world officially are made. But the semioticians of culture have noted for a long time that in most societies, the conflict between visual language and verbal language is the most acute conflict in any culture. Because verbal language is more abstract, conceptual, the meaning is conceptual. As far as the non-verbal language, but their meaning are more of a perceptual nature. Their reference is more linked to perceptual experience of the world, to emotional experience of the world. And even psychologists in very empirical fields will say that visual language or language related to the right side of the brain are best able to deal with emotions, to treat emotions, and talk really about concrete experiences of the world, which are the basic levels, one would say, of human experience. Now, you can have conceptual thinking about it, but the concrete relation of anyone with the world is on a perceptual level, on our senses, that we have information about anything existing outside ourselves. And also inside ourselves, we have also to get a kind of perception of interior emotions, tensions, what happens in our mind, what happens in our body, in our emotions, So we have evolved a grammar, a syntax of visual language, which is based mainly on perception, study of perception. So then we incorporate information from psychology of perception, from cognitive sciences. So one could say that today visual semiotics is something very hot, because verbal languages and verbal grammars now are getting conscious that very, very often when you have a verbal statement, it relates to a perceptual experience. But how is perceptual experience organized? Verbal language cannot say. But visual language, based on perception, allows us to understand how we perceive the world, how we create interrelations between objects and ourselves. So the whole, let's say, models of visual semiotics, I think will come very handy for the new current in verbal linguistics, which has been revolutionized by cognitive sciences. And then there will be quite a close and fruitful association between the two.
Can you give us some specific example of how to, some of the classification system of a visual semiotics?
Well, the fundamental difference between visual semiotics and verbal semiotics, as I say, though this is changing, is the fact that visual semiotics are based on perception. And it recognizes that the perception is a very egocentric, mobile, different, very complex process, and that the visual representation is only built through some individual perception. So it tries to correct this and try to understand how we could construct a representation of a perception of the world upon which we can make consensus to go to some kind of meaning hypothesis. But the other very important aspect of visual semiotics is that it's based on the notion of space. And it had then to incorporate many new currents of thought or epistemological currents, which are stating since the middle of the 19th century that that space is something which is constructed through perception. It's not something that we perceive as such. It's not data. You get information from various indices from the world, and you construct space. You construct that, but you don't perceive that. So space is a very, very curious notion, because it is a mental representation, a construct that we make in our head, in the nervous system, in manipulating some stimuli that come from the other place. So until now, people felt, many people feel that there is only one kind of space, that there would be a real space. But there cannot be a real space out there, objective real space, because space is a mental representation construct. So we have this idea, and we, in our societies, we have equated the real space with the Euclidean space. But as I was saying, in the middle of the 19th century, science has evolved other models for space, non-Euclidean geometry, with topology, projective geometry. So these intuitions or construct of spaces are those which have been used by many contemporary artists, namely abstract artists, who are not interested anymore to reproduce the kind of space that the Renaissance built up from Euclidean geometry to represent objects at very far distances. It was forbidden, in a way, to be interested in the representation of the close to you, or very close to the body, or produced by the body, or in a very intimate proximate distance. So the Renaissance perspective was a kind of ideological structure which said that the world, the visual world, or perceptual world, is organized as such, and that it has to, the more important thing, what organizes them is really the point of view, the dislocation on the horizon from which everything would be organized. So the artists were not allowed to express close, intimate, proxemic experiences of the world, textures, emotion, kinesthesia, in a proxemic context, and they had to, it was an ideological imposement to represent, to see the world only as something which has a very great distance, and the very important thing was that thing there, which would unite. Naturally, it's a kind of a mirror, I would say, a certain philosophy or theology, that would see that we have to see the world only in these terms. But to come back to personal experience or physical experience, corporal experience, was not accepted. But the whole of 20th century went to the contrary. Now the artists want to express their close experience of the world. And one would say that the popularity that photography has enjoyed is the fact that not only that one would miniaturize some object and put it in our hand, very close, but first we miniaturize and we think we know it, we dominate it. It's out there, huge mountains or everything. It's on the wall here. So. And also, it is close. It is smaller, you dominate it, and it's close to you. Photography gives you the possibility of everything close to you. Well, in fact, it's the same kind of trends which went into abstract art, but then when abstract art changed the perspectives from the perspective of the Renaissance or the very far distances and came to very close distances which were more topological in nature, when actually most people didn't know what it meant. They tried to recognize visual things, and they were not visual things which were represented, they were experiences, models of emotional interaction, and also of things known without the eyes. You see, this is paradoxical of visual language. That because it's spatial, visual language is three-dimensional, because it's spatial, all other kinds of spaces can be expressed through it, not only the visual spaces, but also the thermic spaces, the kinesthetic spaces, the postural spaces, the all other kind of organic spaces into which our experience evolves can be expressed by a language which is spatial. But people are always looking to the visual.
What about color? What does color fit into that?
Color is fundamental because visual language is basically, well, the whole world cannot be known, cannot distinguish any object except by contrasting color, so it's fundamental. But color is a very strange phenomenon, like any other thing that we discover now. It's not really a real. Objects don't have color. Color is only a reflection of light from objects. So what we see, the color, is only the vibrating energy of light, wavelengths, the different kinds of wavelengths that give you color. That is fundamental. But because of this very vibratory, energetic nature of light, what comes from a painting is also very mobile, and also perception itself is quite mobile and changing. So the color changes when they are carried through different sorts of visual variables. So this grammar has evolved. What are the visual variables? And it states that whenever, which are texture, dimension, form, vectoriality, so whenever one of the visual variables changes, any one color changes. So you cannot base the whole organization of visual language to color, say, well, it would be the blue, red, yellow, and so. Because color changes all the time. In a way, Mr. Greenhouse was saying that words don't exist. Well, color, let's say a color does not exist. It's a concept. Because any color that you take in a jar and you put there, what you put there cannot be the same color as what it is here, because the way it's applied will change the color. And this color, then, if you have applied there, if you put another color beside it, you put a red and put a yellow beside it or blue, but that color that you put there has changed. So color is very, very important, but it cannot be a stable basis for the analysis of visual representation. You have to take into account all the visual variables and the interrelations then between these forces and energies coming out of the reverberation of light.
So space gets priority because it is more stable?
No, space changes all the time. But it's made up of various components which themselves change. But there are some, within all these changes, there are, let's say, laws of the change. So it's mainly from the work of the Gestalt psychology that we know something about the laws of perception. These are the laws that regulate the changes, but they are always changes. But they have formulated general laws as to how things change. So it's possible then to make a description of the space of a work. And why do we study artwork instead of other things? It's because, as far as visual language is very specific, it is really what we call visual art that has been a domain which has been developed in a very free way, aside from the ideologies of verbal religions, philosophy, and all that. The artists, even if they had to do a certain subject, Madonna or something like that, in fact, they changed the organization as they wished. They were the ones who evolved and developed all kinds of spaces and perspectives and structures of representation. And it's there that you have the wide field of all the possibilities until now of what the visual language is. So you have to go there and study it. Then you can come back on any kind of visual imagery, photography, drawing, advertising, because they're all dependent on one or the other of the visual structures that have been evolved in visual art anyway.
This is a much more speculative question. The development of three-dimensional space during the Renaissance was linked to the rise of science and the whole development. Now, why is it that at this point there is an emergence of a visual semiotic? I mean, what new ideologies are being formed, or is it being part of, or one new development is being part of?
Well, I think it is the kind of explosion of cognitive sciences, which before were not felt to be that important, because it was felt that verbal language, as we mentioned earlier, that the meaning, like Saussure said, you have the sign is made up of a signifier and a signified, and the signified is a concept. But this is what is really challenged now in verbal linguistics, is that it's not the meaning, the content is not a concept, it is a person. What Grimauss would call figurative element. So then those perception, the result of our interaction through perception with reality, how are they constructed? You see? So all cognitive science now have been called upon to be inserted in verbal linguistics. So they try to speak about perceptual constructs. But in visual semiotics, we deal only with perceptual constructs on all kinds of levels. Tactile, motor, kinesthetic. So visual semiotics is a kind of a field where we're trying to describe and understand more what is perceptual experience. So verbal linguistics will have to go there, because they would accept the idea that the words have a reference to perceptual, but how to understand the kind of perceptual construct. So you need then a kind of an epistemology of the perceptual world, and also perceptual representations in the mind, because that's what it's all about also in verbal language. When you see my house is red, actually you refer to perception when you're talking also something which is in your head. So there are perceptual relations to object outside, but also the whole field of how mental representations carry on perceptual knowledge, and how it is organized inside our head, which is not organized the same way things are organized in the world. So how is meaning? Then meaning is in the head. You need something to construct, something to deduce. If it's a perceptual nature, you will construct your meaning of a visual work, and also the sentence. Now we do agree on that now. You have to construct that knowing more about mental representations. Well, mental representations are made up quite a lot of perceptual elements, which behave, one should say, differently, as I said, in the objects in the world. So now cognitive science or linguistics are very, very much interested in studying mental representation. How do we not only represent the world, but how do we represent our knowledge of the world? It must be there somewhere, because we go to it when we speak. So how is this organized inside the brain? So it's biology and all sciences are called upon to help us to understand, because when we speak most of the time, we're not talking about reality, as I know last minute. We're only talking about things which goes on in our heads, only mental representations. But how do they work? How are they interrelated? How come that they go that way? And how do they construct models of the world, and of ourselves, of human beings?
Is there any work done on the linkages and the mediation between the precept and the concept?
The percepts, not the precepts. Percepts and the concept. Well, I would say that it is a feeling. Everyone is working on it, I would say now. When I mean verbal language, I mean Lakoff and Yakendorf, Grice, and all the others who are quite engaged in this in America. certainly in Europe, they are less inclined to feel that there would be any real interest in studying perception. But I think they will have to go because semiotics is a young science, science in gestation, and I think this is really now the turning point, where instead of thinking that verbal language could be defined that way, in fact we have to enlarge. We certainly have concepts, but we also have perception. And both have to be, as you say, have to be in interrelation. And what are their relations? And well, it's still different. To give an example of what is, Langacker, who was here, I don't know if you remember to meet him, in his book in '82, you see, Foundations of a Cognitive Grammar. He gives the example, for instance, when you hear the word banana. Well, naturally, if you take the time and the trouble, you can find the concept of that. So it's just think, I don't know how you would define the concept. But when you use the word, is it possible that you don't evoke in your head the image of something yellow, which has that form? Sometimes percepts are always evoked by words, and most of the time, some would say, it's mostly the image, perceptual image, which is convoked in the head. We don't take the trouble to go and see the conceptual definition of objects as soon as we have a perceptual image. But perceptual images in our head are not easy to study because they're inside and they're mobile, fused, but they are that with which we construct our discourses in our attitude. So we have to go and try to know more about these. And I think visual semiotics will evolve in trying to understand how these perceptual constructs are in our head and how they correspond to what we see.
Also, given the dominance of the simulacrum and the simulated experiences of the media and all of that, becomes extremely important.
To understand how it works. Yeah.
With development.
Okay.